I'm Sophia Martinez, 26 years old, and I'm standing in my childhood bedroom for the last time, packing the final pieces of a life that never really belonged to me. The letter I'm about to leave downstairs contains secrets that will shatter everything my family believes about their perfect golden child. My sister Rebecca has no idea what's coming. Neither do my parents, who spent decades choosing her over me in every single decision that mattered. What I wrote in that letter would destroy everything they thought they knew about their perfect daughter, and honestly, after 26 years of being invisible in my own home, I couldn't wait to watch their world crumble. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're ready to hear how one letter changed everything. Make sure to subscribe because you won't believe what happens next when the truth finally comes out. Growing up in the Martinez household meant learning early that there was only room for one star, and that star would never be me. Rebecca, my younger sister by 3 years, claimed that spotlight from the moment she could walk. While she got private violin lessons at $200 a month, I got her hand-me-down clothes and a lecture about being grateful for what we had. The irony wasn't lost on me that we apparently had enough money for Rebecca's music career dreams but not enough for me to have clothes that actually fit properly. Our parents ran a small but successful Mexican restaurant called Casa Martinez, and even there, the favoritism was impossible to miss. Rebecca got a college fund that grew fatter each year, while I was expected to work for free during summers and weekends, washing dishes and serving tables without a single dollar going toward my future. When I asked about my own college savings, Dad would pat my head and say, "Mija, we're investing in Rebecca's violin because she has real talent. You can always get a job after high school." The message was crystal clear: Rebecca's dreams mattered, mine were just expensive hobbies. High school made the divide even more obvious. When Rebecca won the regional violin competition, my parents threw a party and invited half the neighborhood. They framed her trophy and hung it in the restaurant's main dining room where every customer could see their talented daughter. 6 months later, when I received a full scholarship to study art therapy at the state university, Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. "Art school? That's nice, Sophia, but you know those degrees don't really lead anywhere stable." Mom just nodded along, already planning Rebecca's next competition outfit with money that could have celebrated my achievement instead. The pattern continued through Rebecca's high school graduation party, where my parents spent $25,000 on a celebration that looked more like a wedding reception than a graduation. They rented out the community center, hired a mariachi band, and invited 300 people to celebrate their baby girl's bright future. 2 years earlier, when I graduated as valedictorian of my class, they took me to Denny's and called it a celebration. I ordered the cheapest item on the menu because I could see Dad calculating costs in his head even during what was supposed to be my moment. But the final straw came just last month, on Rebecca's engagement announcement day. She'd been dating David for barely 8 months, but apparently, that was long enough for my parents to decide she deserved their ultimate gift. They announced at Sunday dinner, with tears of joy in their eyes, that they were giving Rebecca and David the house as a wedding present. Our family home, worth nearly $400,000, would become Rebecca's starter home because young couples need help getting established these days. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, remembering how just 6 months earlier, I'd begged them for $500 to buy textbooks for my community college courses. I was working 3 part-time jobs trying to finish my degree in art therapy, sleeping 4 hours a night and living on ramen noodles. When I asked for help with those textbooks, Mom had sighed dramatically and said, "Sophia, you're 26 years old. Isn't it time you learned to support yourself instead of always asking us for handouts?" Yet here they were, literally giving away a house to their 23-year-old daughter who'd never worked a day in her life. That night, lying in my childhood bed for what I thought might be the last time, I finally understood the truth that had been staring me in the face for 26 years. I wasn't their daughter, I was Rebecca's supporting character. Every decision they made, every dollar they spent, every moment of attention they gave was calculated to benefit Rebecca's story while treating me as nothing more than background scenery. They didn't love me less than Rebecca, they didn't love me at all. I was just the family member who existed to make Rebecca look better by comparison. 3 days after Rebecca's house announcement, our lives took a turn that none of us saw coming. Mr. Henderson, our family lawyer, called an emergency meeting to discuss Grandma Elena's will. She'd passed away 2 months earlier, and while we'd all attended the reading, Mr. Henderson had mentioned there were some additional provisions that needed to be handled privately. I assumed it was just paperwork about her old furniture or maybe some small savings account nobody knew about. Walking into Mr. Henderson's office that Tuesday afternoon, I could feel my parents' excitement radiating off them in waves. They kept whispering to each other about how Mama always loved Rebecca best and wondering if Grandma had left money for Rebecca's wedding. Rebecca herself was practically bouncing in her chair, already mentally spending whatever inheritance she thought was coming her way. She'd been Grandma's obvious favorite during family gatherings, always getting the biggest hugs and the most attention during holiday visits. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and opened a thick manila folder. Elena Martinez was very specific about these final provisions. She wanted to wait until after the funeral to reveal them because she knew they might cause family tension. He pulled out an official-looking document and adjusted his glasses. Elena has left her entire estate to Sophia Martinez, including her $300,000 trust fund, her complete jewelry collection valued at approximately $50,000, and the original Casa Martinez property on 5th Street. The silence in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Mom's face went completely white, while Dad's jaw dropped so low I thought it might hit the floor. Rebecca made a sound like a wounded animal, a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. I sat there, completely stunned, trying to process what Mr. Henderson had just said. "I'm sorry," Dad finally managed to stammer out, "but there must be some mistake." Rebecca was Mama's favorite. She spent every Sunday with her, helped her with groceries, drove her to church. "This has to be wrong." He was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had turned completely white. Mr. Henderson shook his head gently and pulled out another document. Actually, according to Elena's detailed records, Sophia was the only family member who consistently visited her at Sunset Manor. She came every Tuesday and Thursday evening for the past 3 years, even when Elena could no longer remember her name due to the dementia. Elena specifically mentioned that Rebecca only visited during holidays and usually spent those visits talking about herself rather than asking about Elena's well-being. Rebecca exploded out of her chair like she'd been shot from a cannon. "That's not true. I loved Grandma. I visited her all the time. This is ridiculous." She was pacing back and forth in front of Mr. Henderson's desk, her face flushed red with rage. Sophia probably manipulated her when she was sick. Old people with dementia can be convinced of anything. But Mr. Henderson wasn't finished. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandma's shaky handwriting. "Elena asked me to give you this personally, Sophia. She said it would explain everything." My hands trembled as I opened it and read Grandma's final words to me. "My dearest Sophia, you were the only one who saw me as a person instead of a bank account. You brought me flowers from your garden, read me stories when my eyes got bad, and held my hand when I was scared about forgetting everyone I loved. You never asked me for money or complained about your family to me. You just loved me. Everything I have is yours because you're the only one who deserves it. Don't let them bully you into giving it away. You've earned every penny by being the granddaughter I always hoped for." The room erupted into chaos as I finished reading. Rebecca was screaming about unfairness and manipulation while Mom cried about how Mama must have been confused in her final years. Dad was already on his phone, probably calling another lawyer to see if they could contest the will. Through all the noise and drama, Mr. Henderson remained calm and professional, explaining that Grandma had been declared mentally competent right up until her death and that the will was absolutely ironclad. "There has to be something we can do," Mom pleaded through her tears. "Rebecca is getting married in 6 months. She needs this money for her wedding and her future. Sophia doesn't even have a boyfriend, let alone wedding plans. It's not fair for her to get everything when Rebecca has so many expenses coming up." That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Even faced with legal documentation and Grandma's own words, they still couldn't accept that I might deserve something good. Their first instinct wasn't happiness for me or pride in the relationship I'd built with our grandmother. Instead, they immediately started calculating how to take it away from me and give it to Rebecca, just like they'd done with everything else my entire life. The drive home from Mr. Henderson's office was silent except for Rebecca's occasional sniffles and Dad's angry muttering under his breath. But once we walked through the front door, the real manipulation campaign began in earnest. Rebecca transformed instantly from shocked and angry to heartbroken and victimized, throwing herself onto the living room couch like a tragic heroine in some overdramatic telenovela. "I just don't understand how this happened," she sobbed, making sure her tears were visible to everyone in the room. "Grandma always told me I reminded her of herself when she was young. She said I had her musical talent and her beauty. How could she leave everything to Sophia when I'm the one who needs it most? My wedding is going to cost $40,000, and David and I were counting on this inheritance to help us start our life together." Mom immediately rushed to comfort her baby girl, shooting accusatory looks at me like I'd personally stolen Christmas from the entire family. "Don't worry, Mija. I'm sure Sophia will do the right thing and share this inheritance with you. After all, families are supposed to support each other, and you have so many expenses coming up with the wedding and the house." Over the next few days, the pressure campaign intensified beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Rebecca would burst into tears every time she saw me, claiming that losing the inheritance felt like losing Grandma all over again. She'd cornered every family member at Dad's birthday party, telling them how devastated she was and how unfair the situation had become. By the end of the weekend, I was getting phone calls from cousins and aunts suggesting I'd be generous with my unexpected windfall. But it was my friend Maria who really opened my eyes to what was happening behind the scenes. She worked part-time as a server at Sophia Martinez and had overheard my parents having intense conversations with Rebecca about legal options and family obligations. According to Maria, they'd already contacted 2 different lawyers about challenging the will and had been researching whether they could claim Grandma wasn't mentally competent when she made her final decisions. "They're planning something, Sophia," Maria warned me over coffee at our usual spot downtown. "Your mom was on the phone with someone yesterday talking about undue influence and how you isolated your grandmother from the rest of the family. They're trying to build a case that you manipulated her into changing her will." The accusations stung because they were so completely backwards from reality. I'd spent hundreds of hours at Sunset Manor not because I wanted something from Grandma, but because watching someone you love slip away piece by piece is terrifying when you're facing it alone. Rebecca had visited maybe a dozen times in 3 years, and even then, she'd spent most of those visits complaining about her college workload or asking Grandma for money to cover her sorority expenses. Things got even more complicated when David, Rebecca's fiancé, approached me privately after Sunday dinner. He was a decent guy who worked as an accountant and seemed genuinely confused by the family drama swirling around the inheritance. "Sophia, can I ask you something? Rebecca has been talking about this money like your grandmother promised it to her specifically. She's already made deposits on wedding vendors assuming this inheritance was coming. Did your grandmother ever actually tell Rebecca she'd be getting this money?" I realized then that Rebecca had been living in a fantasy world where she'd already spent Grandma's inheritance multiple times over. She'd booked the most expensive wedding venue in town, ordered a dress that cost more than I made in 3 months, and planned a honeymoon in Europe, all based on money that had never actually been promised to her. David's question made me wonder what other lies Rebecca had been telling to support her extravagant lifestyle. The situation reached a breaking point when I discovered what my parents had been doing with my childhood savings account. I'd been putting birthday money and summer job earnings into that account since I was 12 years old, and I'd assumed it had been growing with interest over the years. When I went to the bank to check on it, planning to use some of those savings to help with college expenses, I found out the account had been drained 2 years earlier. The bank records showed regular withdrawals totaling nearly $8,000, all signed for by my parents as joint account holders. The timing of those withdrawals coincided perfectly with Rebecca's senior year of college when she'd been struggling with tuition payments and living expenses. My parents had literally stolen my childhood savings to pay for Rebecca's education without ever telling me or asking for permission. When I confronted them about the missing money, Dad had the audacity to act like I was being unreasonable. "Sophia, that money was just sitting there doing nothing. Rebecca needed help with school, and you weren't even using those savings. We always planned to pay it back when the restaurant had a good year." But I knew they'd never intended to repay it because they'd never even planned to tell me it was gone. That's when Uncle Carlos, Dad's older brother, started asking questions that made everyone uncomfortable. He'd always been the black sheep of the family because he'd moved to California and made his fortune in real estate instead of staying home to help with the family business. But he'd also been the one person who'd occasionally called out my parents' obvious favoritism over the years. "How exactly does a 23-year-old afford a $40,000 wedding on a part-time retail salary?" Uncle Carlos asked during one particularly tense family dinner. "And why is everyone so angry at Sophia for inheriting money that was never Rebecca's in the first place? Seems to me like Elena made her choice based on who actually spent time with her instead of who just showed up expecting handouts." His questions hung in the air like smoke, making everyone squirm because nobody had good answers. Rebecca's perfect image was starting to develop cracks, and for the first time in my life, someone was publicly questioning whether she really deserved all the special treatment she'd always received. 2 weeks after the inheritance revelation, I was getting a glass of water from the kitchen when I heard Rebecca's voice drifting through the back door. She was on the patio, talking on her phone in that animated way she always did when she thought nobody was listening. What I heard made my blood run cold and changed everything I thought I knew about my sister's fairy tale romance. "Listen, Jenny, once I get this inheritance money from Sophia, I'm seriously thinking about calling off this whole wedding anyway," Rebecca was saying, her voice filled with a casual cruelty I'd never heard before. "David is sweet and all, but he's so boring. Did you see Marcus at the bar last weekend? Now that's the kind of guy I should be with. Rich, exciting, and he actually knows how to have fun instead of lecturing me about budgets and savings accounts all the time." I stood there frozen, afraid to move and risk making noise that would alert her to my presence. Rebecca continued talking, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire family believed she was madly in love with David and planning the wedding of her dreams. "The thing is, if I can get Sophia to split that inheritance with me, I'll have enough money to be independent for a few years while I figure out what I really want to do. David keeps talking about starting a family right after the wedding, but honestly, I'm way too young to be tied down with kids and a mortgage. I need time to live my life first, you know?" My hands were shaking as I processed what she was saying. This wasn't just about the money, it was about Rebecca using David's love for her as a stepping stone to a lifestyle she thought she deserved. She was planning to take his financial support, my inheritance money, and our parents' house gift, then abandon him once she had enough resources to pursue whatever selfish dreams were floating through her head that week. But that was just the beginning of the revelations. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Rebecca's activities and discovered a pattern of deception that went back years. The college transcripts she'd proudly shown our parents were fake. She'd actually failed 3 classes and had been on academic probation twice. When I called her former roommate under the pretense of planning a surprise party, I learned that Rebecca had cheated on multiple exams and had paid other students to write her papers. The successful internship she'd bragged about at a prestigious marketing firm turned out to be a paid position that Dad had arranged through his friend Miguel, who owned the company. Rebecca had never actually applied for the job or demonstrated any real skills, she'd simply shown up and been handed a fake title and a paycheck for doing basically nothing. Even her college graduation photos were misleading because she'd actually finished a semester later than her class due to all the failed courses she'd had to repeat. Most shocking of all was discovering the truth about Rebecca's supposed charity work. For years, she'd talked about volunteering at a local children's shelter, and she'd even used this volunteer experience on her college applications and job resume. But when I drove by the shelter and asked about her involvement, the director looked confused. Rebecca Martinez? I'm sorry, but I don't think we have anyone by that name on our volunteer roster. Are you sure you have the right organization? It turned out that Mom had been donating money to the shelter every month and telling them it was on behalf of Rebecca Martinez, to create the appearance that Rebecca was involved with their cause. Rebecca had never actually spent a single hour helping children or anyone else. She'd just been taking credit for Mom's donations while using the fake volunteer work to make herself look compassionate and community-minded. The evidence of Rebecca's deception kept mounting like a house of cards ready to collapse. Her job offers from 3 different companies were actually just informational interviews that she'd inflated into concrete opportunities. The successful art pieces she'd sold were actually purchased by Dad's restaurant customers who felt pressured to buy them to maintain their relationship with Casa Martinez. Even her high school academic achievements had been artificially boosted by Mom volunteering as a classroom aide and essentially doing Rebecca's homework for her during school hours. When I finally worked up the courage to confront Rebecca privately about what I'd discovered, her mask didn't just slip, it completely disintegrated. We were alone in the house while our parents were at the restaurant, and I laid out everything I'd learned about her fake accomplishments, her planned betrayal of David, and her years of manipulating the family's perceptions. You think you're so smart, don't you? Rebecca snarled, dropping all pretense of being the sweet, innocent daughter our parents adored. You think digging up dirt on me is going to change anything? Newsflash, Sophia, Mom and Dad will never believe you over me. I'm their favorite, their princess, their success story. You're just the jealous older sister who couldn't handle seeing me succeed. Her voice was filled with a venom I'd never heard before, and for the first time, I was seeing Rebecca's true personality without any of the performance she usually maintained around family. I've always hated you, she continued, stepping closer with a cruel smile spreading across her face. Do you want to know why? Because you actually think you matter. You walk around here with your art projects and your little part-time jobs acting like you're some kind of independent success story, but you're nothing. You're a 26-year-old loser who still lives with her parents and works at a coffee shop. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was calling me a failure while admitting to years of fraud and deception, but Rebecca wasn't finished destroying whatever remnants of sister love might have existed between us. You think Grandma left you that money because she loved you? She left it to you because she was getting senile and confused. Everyone knows you manipulated a sick old woman into changing her will. That money belongs to me, and I'm going to get it one way or another. When she threatened to destroy me if I told our parents about what I'd discovered, I realized that Rebecca saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome rather than a sister to love. She'd spent our entire childhood competing with me for resources and attention, but it had never been a fair competition because she'd been cheating the whole time while I'd been playing by the rules. Of course, when our parents came home and found us in the middle of our heated argument, they immediately assumed I was the aggressor. Sophia, how dare you attack your sister when she's already going through such a difficult time? Mom rushed to Rebecca's side while Dad pointed his finger at me like I was some kind of criminal. Rebecca is stressed about the wedding and the inheritance situation, and instead of supporting her, you're making everything worse. Rebecca had instantly transformed back into victim mode, complete with crocodile tears and trembling hands. She's trying to turn everyone against me, Mom. She's making up lies about my college grades and saying terrible things about David. I think she's jealous that I'm getting married and starting my life while she's still stuck here working dead-end jobs. Standing there watching my parents comfort their lying, cheating, manipulative daughter while treating me like the family villain, I finally understood that the truth didn't matter in our household. Rebecca had spent 23 years perfecting her performance, and our parents were so invested in believing that performance that they'd reject any evidence that contradicted their preferred narrative. I could have handed them video footage of Rebecca's deception, and they would have found a way to blame me for creating it. The next morning brought an unexpected knock on my door. David stood there looking like he hadn't slept in days, his usually neat hair disheveled and his accountant's sense of order clearly shaken. Sophia, I need to talk to you about Rebecca. Something's not adding up, and I think you might have answers I need to hear. We sat in my small apartment above the garage, a space I'd moved into 3 months earlier when living in the main house became unbearable. David looked around at my simple but clean living space, probably wondering why I'd chosen to live in what was essentially a converted storage room rather than the comfortable bedroom I'd occupied for most of my life. "Rebecca's been acting strange lately," David began, fidgeting with his engagement ring in a way that suggested he was having serious doubts. "She's become obsessed with money and keeps talking about all these expensive plans she wants to make after we're married. When I try to discuss our budget or suggest we start smaller, she gets angry and accuses me of not wanting her to be happy. Yesterday she told me that if her family doesn't do the right thing about the inheritance, we might need to postpone the wedding indefinitely." I could see the confusion and hurt in David's eyes as he tried to reconcile the woman he'd fallen in love with and the person Rebecca was revealing herself to be under pressure. He was a good man who'd worked hard to save money for their future together, and it was becoming clear that Rebecca saw his careful financial planning as an obstacle rather than a foundation for their relationship. "There's something else," David continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Last week, Rebecca asked me to pressure you about splitting the inheritance with her. She said that if I really loved her, I'd help convince you that keeping all that money to yourself was selfish and wrong. When I told her that your grandmother's wishes should be respected, she accused me of not caring about her happiness." Before I could respond, we heard a car pulling into the driveway. Through my small window, I saw Uncle Carlos climbing out of his rental car, looking determined and carrying what appeared to be a thick folder of documents. He'd flown in from California specifically to get to the bottom of this family drama, and something about his expression suggested he'd uncovered information that would change everything. Uncle Carlos knocked on my door and seemed unsurprised to find David already there. "Good, you're both here. I've been doing some investigating into this whole situation, and I think it's time everyone learned the truth about what's been happening in this family for years." He set the folder down on my small kitchen table and pulled out photographs, bank statements, and what looked like school records. "Carlos, what's all this?" I asked, though part of me already suspected that Uncle Carlos had been documenting the favoritism and manipulation that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. "This is evidence," he said simply, opening the folder to reveal years of documentation. "I've been watching your parents treat you like second-class citizen while treating Rebecca like visiting royalty, and I finally decided to find out whether their favorite daughter actually deserved all that special treatment." The photographs he spread across the table told a story I'd never seen from an outside perspective. There were pictures from family gatherings where Rebecca was always prominently featured while I was either missing entirely or positioned at the edge of group shots like an afterthought. There were images from birthdays and holidays where Rebecca's celebrations were elaborate affairs while my special occasions were barely acknowledged. But it was Maria's arrival 20 minutes later that really solidified our unexpected alliance. She'd brought her own evidence in the form of recordings she'd made on her phone while working at the restaurant. Apparently, she'd been documenting my parents' conversations for weeks, hoping to protect me from whatever scheme they were developing. "I know this might sound like spying," Maria said apologetically, "but after what happened with your savings account, I was worried they were planning something even worse. Listen to this conversation your parents had yesterday while they thought nobody was around." The recording was crystal clear, and hearing my parents' voices discussing me like I was a problem to be solved rather than their daughter was more painful than I'd expected. Mom's voice came through the phone speaker, "We need to find a way to make Sophia understand that keeping all that money is selfish. Rebecca has always been the responsible one, the one with plans for the future. Sophia will probably just waste it on art supplies or something equally pointless." Dad's voice responded with frustration evident in every word, "Maybe we should tell her that if she doesn't share with Rebecca, she's no longer welcome at family gatherings. Sometimes you have to force people to do the right thing when they're too selfish to see it themselves." The recording continued with them discussing strategies for isolating me from extended family members and community friends until I came to my senses about the inheritance. They were literally planning to systematically destroy my relationships and support system until I had no choice but to give in to their demands. David looked sick as he listened to my parents plotting against their own daughter. This is insane. They're talking about you like you're some kind of enemy instead of their child. No wonder Rebecca thinks she can treat people however she wants if this is the kind of behavior she's grown up watching. Uncle Carlos wasn't finished with his revelations. He pulled out academic records that showed Rebecca's real college performance, financial documents that revealed the extent of my parents' secret payments to support her lifestyle, and even more evidence of the fake volunteer work and inflated achievements that had been supporting Rebecca's false reputation for years. The most disturbing thing I discovered, Uncle Carlos said, is that your parents have been actively sabotaging opportunities for you while creating fake opportunities for Rebecca. Remember when you applied for that art therapy program at the state university and got rejected despite having excellent grades? I contacted the admissions office. Your mother called them and told them you'd changed your mind about attending and asked them to give your spot to someone else. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I'd been devastated when I received the rejection letter, especially since my grades and test scores had been well above their admission requirements. I'd spent months wondering what I'd done wrong in my application, never imagining that my own mother had deliberately sabotaged my chances at the education I'd worked so hard to achieve. They've been controlling your life by limiting your options, Uncle Carlos continued, while artificially expanding Rebecca's options through connections, payments, and outright fraud. This isn't just favoritism, it's systematic abuse disguised as family loyalty. As our group sat around my tiny kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of decades of manipulation and deception, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't facing the family dysfunction alone. David was seeing Rebecca's true nature and questioning whether he wanted to tie his future to someone capable of such sustained deception. Maria was willing to risk her job to document the truth and protect me from further harm. Uncle Carlos was using his resources and connections to expose the lies that had been shaping our family's narrative for years. Mrs. Chen, my former art professor, had even agreed to provide character references and testimony about my artistic abilities and work ethic if needed. She'd always believed in my potential and had been one of the few adults in my life who'd consistently encouraged me to pursue my dreams rather than settle for whatever scraps the family decided I deserved. For the first time in 26 years, I had allies who were willing to stand up to the Martinez family machine and tell the truth about what they'd been doing to me. The question now was whether we could gather enough evidence and support to finally break the cycle of manipulation that had defined my entire existence. The family intervention happened on a Tuesday evening, exactly 3 weeks after the inheritance announcement. My parents had been planning it like a military operation, enlisting Rebecca's help to create the perfect emotional ambush designed to break down my defenses and force me to do the right thing for the family. They'd arranged the living room like a courtroom, with chairs positioned so that I'd be facing all 3 of them while sitting alone on the opposite side of the coffee table. Mom had even prepared what looked like a presentation, complete with written notes about all the reasons why sharing the inheritance was the loving thing to do. Sophia, we need to talk, Dad began in his most serious voice, the one he usually reserved for discussing restaurant business or disciplining employees who'd made serious mistakes. This situation with your grandmother's inheritance has gone on long enough, and it's tearing our family apart. Your mother and I have been losing sleep over this, and Rebecca has been crying herself to sleep every night knowing that her own sister doesn't care about her happiness. Rebecca was already dabbing at her eyes with tissues, preparing for what I now recognized as her standard victim performance. She'd positioned herself in the chair closest to Mom, making sure she had immediate access to comfort and support when the tears started flowing in earnest. We're not asking you to give Rebecca everything, Mom added, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and caring rather than demanding. We're just asking you to be fair and think about what's best for the whole family. Rebecca has wedding expenses, and she and David are trying to start their lives together. You don't have any immediate financial pressures, so sharing would be the generous thing to do. I sat there listening to their carefully rehearsed speeches, marveling at how they'd managed to convince themselves that asking me to give away half of my inheritance was somehow a reasonable request. They'd spent weeks building up to this moment, believing that if they applied enough emotional pressure and family guilt, I'd crumble and hand over the money just to make the drama stop. Furthermore, Dad continued, pulling out what looked like vendor contracts and payment receipts, Rebecca has already made deposits on wedding services based on the assumption that she'd be receiving part of this inheritance. The venue alone required a $10,000 deposit, and the catering company needs another $15,000 next month. If she doesn't get this money, she'll lose everything she's already paid for. That's when I realized the full scope of their manipulation. They hadn't just been pressuring me emotionally, they'd been creating financial obligations in Rebecca's name that would make it nearly impossible for her to cancel the wedding without massive financial losses. They'd essentially trapped both Rebecca and David in an expensive commitment that could only be fulfilled if I gave up my inheritance rights. You see, Sophia? Rebecca finally spoke up, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine distress. I'm not trying to be greedy or selfish. I just trusted that we'd work this out as a family, and now I'm stuck with all these contracts and obligations. If I lose those deposits, David and I won't be able to afford a wedding at all, and we'll have to postpone our engagement indefinitely. The emotional manipulation was masterful, I had to admit. They'd created a scenario where saying no to their demands meant I'd be directly responsible for destroying Rebecca's wedding, disappointing David, and causing massive financial losses that would affect everyone except me. In their minds, they'd constructed the perfect guilt trap that no reasonable family member could possibly resist. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was still the same doormat who'd spent 26 years absorbing their emotional abuse and accepting their twisted version of family loyalty. They had no idea that I'd spent the last 3 weeks gathering evidence, building alliances, and finally seeing their behavior with clear eyes instead of the desperate hope for love that had blinded me for so many years. Actually, I said, pulling out my own folder of documents, I think we need to talk about Rebecca's real financial situation before we discuss any inheritance sharing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as I laid out copies of Rebecca's credit card statements, which Uncle Carlos had helped me obtain through his connections. Her debt was staggering. Over $30,000 spread across 6 different cards, all accumulated through shopping sprees, restaurant bills, and entertainment expenses that she'd been hiding from everyone, including David. These statements show that Rebecca has been living far beyond her means for years, I explained, watching their faces change from confidence to confusion to outright panic. The inheritance money wouldn't be going toward building a life with David. It would be going toward paying off debts that she's accumulated through irresponsible spending. Dad grabbed the papers from my hands, his eyes widening as he processed the numbers. This can't be right. Rebecca told us she was being careful with money. She said she was saving for the wedding. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the recordings Maria had made, the evidence of Rebecca's fake academic achievements, and the proof that she'd been lying to David about her feelings for him. Before you ask me to give Rebecca half of my inheritance, I think you should know exactly who you're asking me to support. The next 20 minutes were chaos as I presented evidence that systematically destroyed every assumption my parents had made about their perfect daughter. The fake college transcripts, the paid-for grades, the non-existent volunteer work, the lies about job offers, and the recorded conversation where Rebecca admitted to planning to leave David after the wedding. Rebecca tried to deny everything at first, claiming I'd fabricated the evidence or misunderstood private conversations. But when I played the recording of her admitting she didn't really love David and was planning to cancel the wedding once she got the inheritance money, even she couldn't explain away her own voice saying those terrible things. This is ridiculous. Dad finally exploded, his face red with rage and embarrassment. Even if some of this is true, it doesn't change the fact that Rebecca is family and families support each other. You're nitpicking and looking for excuses to be selfish. Mom was crying now, but not for the reasons I'd expected. How could you do this to your sister? Even if she's made some mistakes, airing out her private problems like this is cruel and vindictive. This is exactly the kind of behavior that shows you don't deserve that inheritance in the first place. That's when the full extent of their delusion became crystal clear to me. Even confronted with irrefutable evidence that Rebecca was a liar, a cheater, and a manipulator, they still saw me as the villain in the family story. In their minds, exposing Rebecca's deception was a greater sin than the deception itself because it threatened the narrative they'd built their entire parenting philosophy around. "You know what?" Dad said, standing up and pointing at me like he was delivering some kind of ultimatum. "We've tried to be patient and understanding, but you've made it clear that you don't care about this family or your sister's happiness. Here's how this is going to work. You're going to give Rebecca half of that inheritance money, or you can pack your things and leave this house forever. We don't want a daughter who's so selfish and cruel." Mom nodded through her tears, adding the final blow. "We've given you 26 years to become the daughter we hoped for, but instead, you've become bitter and jealous and vindictive. Rebecca would never treat her sister this way. She has a generous heart and a loving spirit, which is why she deserves good things in life." Rebecca, sensing victory in her parents' ultimatum, stepped up with the smirk I now recognized as her true expression when she thought nobody was watching. "See, Sophia? This is what happens when you try to destroy family relationships out of jealousy. Mom and Dad can see right through your manipulative games. Give me my half of the inheritance, and maybe we can all move past this ugliness you've created." Standing there in that living room, facing three people who'd spent my entire life treating me like a second-class citizen while propping up a daughter who'd built her entire identity on lies and manipulation, I felt something shift inside me that had been building for weeks. The desperate need for their approval, the hope that someday they'd see me as worthy of love, the belief that family loyalty meant absorbing abuse without complaint. All of it just evaporated like morning fog in the sunlight. "You're right," I said, surprising them with my calm tone. "This has gone on long enough. I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning." That night, I sat at my small desk in the apartment above the garage, surrounded by evidence of 26 years of systematic emotional abuse and favoritism. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness as I began typing what would become the most important document I'd ever written. A letter that would finally tell the truth about the Martinez family dynamics and my decision to break free from their toxic system once and for all. The letter started with a simple statement, to the family that never saw me as their daughter, only as Rebecca's supporting character. From there, I laid out everything I'd discovered about Rebecca's deception, but more importantly, I explained how their favoritism had shaped every aspect of my childhood and young adulthood in ways that would take years of therapy to fully understand. I wrote about the birthday parties where Rebecca got elaborate celebrations while my special days were afterthoughts. I detailed the financial support they'd given her for college, music lessons, clothes, and entertainment while expecting me to work for free and pay my own way. I documented the emotional support and encouragement they'd lavished on her dreams while dismissing mine as impractical hobbies. But the hardest part to write was the section about how their treatment had made me feel about myself. "You taught me that love was conditional on being perfect, successful, and undemanding. You showed me that my needs didn't matter as much as Rebecca's wants. You convinced me that asking for help was selfish while giving Rebecca everything she desired without her even having to ask." I included specific examples they couldn't deny. The time they spent my college fund money on Rebecca's car, the way they changed the subject whenever I tried to share my achievements, the casual cruelty of comments like "why can't you be more like your sister" whenever I failed to meet their impossible standards. The letter revealed the truth about my relationship with Grandma Elena, explaining that my visits to Sunset Manor hadn't been calculated moves to secure an inheritance. I visited Grandma because she was lonely and scared, and because she was the only family member who ever made me feel like I mattered as a person rather than as a comparison point for Rebecca's greatness. I wrote about discovering Rebecca's fake achievements, her lies to David, and her plans to abandon him after collecting money from everyone who loved her. But I also wrote about my parents' role in enabling her behavior by protecting her from consequences and providing her with resources she hadn't earned through her own efforts. The most painful section dealt with the realization that they'd never actually loved me, they'd simply tolerated me as long as I served the function of making Rebecca look better by comparison. "You kept me around to be Rebecca's audience, her helper, her inferior sibling who would make her shine brighter by standing in her shadow." I detailed their ultimatum from earlier that evening and explained why I couldn't comply with their demands. Giving Rebecca half of my inheritance wouldn't solve the fundamental problem in our family. It would just reward the same manipulative behavior you've been enabling for years while punishing me for finally standing up for myself. The letter explained my decision to leave permanently and cut all contact with the family. I'm not doing this to hurt you or to punish Rebecca. I'm doing this because I finally understand that I deserve to be loved without conditions, supported without having to earn it through perfect behavior, and valued as an individual rather than as someone's lesser sibling. I included practical details about my plans. I was moving across country to start fresh. I'd already accepted a position at an art therapy clinic that served disadvantaged children, and I was using grandma's inheritance to build a life based on my own values rather than the toxic dynamics I'd grown up accepting as normal. The letter ended with a section I rewrote probably 20 times because I wanted to get the tone exactly right. This isn't goodbye because we were never really connected in the first place. This is me finally acknowledging that the loving family I spent 26 years hoping to earn was never going to exist. I'm choosing to build my own chosen family with people who see my worth without me having to prove it constantly. As I wrote, I made copies of all the evidence I'd gathered: Rebecca's credit card statements, the fake academic records, the recordings of her planned betrayal of David, and documentation of my parents' financial favoritism over the years. David deserved to know the truth about the woman he was planning to marry, and I wanted him to have proof that the red flags he'd been seeing weren't just pre-wedding jitters. I prepared separate envelopes for David, Uncle Carlos, and Maria, each containing relevant documents and personal thank you notes for their support during this difficult time. Uncle Carlos had offered to help me relocate to California and get established in a new city where nobody knew the Martinez family drama. Maria had agreed to serve as a reference for my new job and had promised to keep me informed about any major developments after I left. The hardest decision was whether to include photographs. I'd spent the evening going through old family albums and had noticed something that chilled me to the bone. There were dozens of pictures from family celebrations, holidays, and special occasions, but in at least half of them, I'd been cropped out or positioned at the edge of the frame like an afterthought. Even in our family photos, I'd been treated as less important than Rebecca's central presence. I decided to include copies of these photos with my letter, highlighting the visual evidence of how they'd literally written me out of the family narrative even in their memory keeping. The pictures told a story that no amount of gaslighting could contradict. I'd been the forgotten daughter long before I'd chosen to leave. At 3 a.m, I printed the final version of the letter, sealed it in an envelope with my parents' names, and placed it on the kitchen table downstairs where they'd find it when they came down for breakfast. I also left David's envelope on the front porch where he'd find it when he came to pick up Rebecca for their morning jog. Looking around the house where I'd spent 26 years trying to earn love that was never available, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The desperate anxiety that had characterized my entire relationship with my family was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence that comes from finally making a decision based on self-respect rather than the hope for approval that would never come. By dawn, I was packed and ready to drive toward the life I was choosing for myself instead of the one they'd assigned to me. The letter would speak for itself, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care whether they understood or accepted my perspective. Their opinion of me was no longer the most important factor in my decision-making process, and that shift felt like freedom. I spent that first day after leaving at Maria's apartment, alternating between periods of calm relief and moments of panic about what I'd just done. Cutting ties with your entire family, even a toxic family, feels like jumping off a cliff without knowing whether there's solid ground below or just another endless fall. The first call came at 8:30 a.m. from Uncle Carlos. His voice was a mixture of pride and concern when he told me, "Sophia, your parents found the letter. I can hear your mother screaming from 2 houses away, and your father's car just peeled out of the driveway like he's racing to catch you before you get too far." I turned off my phone after that, knowing that the explosion I'd detonated would take several hours to fully unfold and that I needed space to process my emotions without being bombarded by panicked calls and angry text messages from people who were finally seeing their perfect family narrative collapse in real time. Maria kept me updated throughout the day, since she was still scheduled to work her regular shift at Sophia Martinez and could observe the fallout firsthand. According to her reports, Mom had called in sick to work and had spent the morning crying on the phone with various relatives, explaining that I'd had some kind of breakdown and had made up terrible lies about Rebecca. Dad had apparently driven to every place he thought I might be hiding, including my old high school, the coffee shop where I'd worked part-time, and even the cemetery where Grandma Elena was buried. He was operating under the assumption that this was some kind of temporary rebellion that could be fixed if he could just find me and talk sense into me. But it was Rebecca's reaction that really confirmed everything I'd written in my letter. Instead of feeling hurt or sad that her sister had disappeared, she was furious that her secrets had been exposed and that her carefully constructed image was crumbling. Maria overheard her screaming at our parents about how they'd let Sophia ruin everything and demanding to know how they planned to fix this mess. The real chaos began when David showed up at the restaurant after reading his envelope. Maria said he looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight, and when he asked to speak with Rebecca privately, their conversation could be heard throughout the entire building. He'd brought printed copies of all the evidence I'd given him, and Rebecca's denials became increasingly frantic as he confronted her about each piece of documentation. "You lied to me about everything," David's voice carried through the restaurant, loud enough that even the lunch customers could hear him. "Your college grades, your job prospects, your feelings about our relationship, even your financial situation. How am I supposed to marry someone I don't even know?" Rebecca's response was to blame me for manipulating David with fake evidence and to claim that I'd been plotting against her for months out of jealousy. But when David played the recording of her admitting she planned to cancel their wedding once she got the inheritance money, even Rebecca couldn't explain away her own voice saying those devastating words. By afternoon, my phone was exploding with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, all of whom had apparently been contacted by my parents seeking support for their version of events. But the messages weren't what my parents had expected. Most of my extended family were expressing support for me and sharing their own observations about the favoritism they'd witnessed over the years. My cousin Sandra, who lived in Texas and only visited during major holidays, sent a message that made me cry with relief. "I've been watching your parents treat you like Rebecca's unpaid assistant for years. I'm proud of you for finally standing up for yourself. If you need anything, a place to stay, job references, or just someone to talk to, please call me." Uncle Carlos called again around 4 in the afternoon with an update that was both satisfying and heartbreaking. "Your parents showed up at my hotel demanding that I talk sense into you. When I told them I thought you'd made the right decision, your father actually tried to physically intimidate me. I had to threaten to call hotel security." What really shocked Uncle Carlos was my parents' continued refusal to acknowledge any responsibility for the situation. Even confronted with evidence of Rebecca's deception and years of documentation showing their favoritism, they insisted that the problem was my jealousy and inability to be happy for family members' success. "They're not processing any of this rationally," Uncle Carlos warned me. "They're in complete denial and are convinced that if they can just get you to come home, everything will go back to normal. They don't understand that you're not coming back." The most devastating call came from David around 6 in the evening. His voice was hollow and defeated as he told me about his final conversation with Rebecca. "She admitted that everything in your letter was true, but she claimed it was all justified because she deserved the opportunities and money more than you did. When I told her I was calling off our engagement, she said it didn't matter because she'd been planning to leave me anyway once she got the inheritance." David's pain was evident in every word as he described the woman he thought he'd loved revealing herself to be someone completely different from who she'd pretended to be during their relationship. "The worst part is that I can see now how she was manipulating me the whole time. Every conversation about our future was really about how I could help her maintain the lifestyle she wanted." That evening, Maria brought me copies of the resignation letter Rebecca had submitted at her part-time retail job, along with stories about how she'd spent her final shift blaming everyone except herself for the situation. According to her coworkers, Rebecca had claimed that I'd destroyed her life out of jealousy and that our parents were weak for not forcing me to share the inheritance. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Uncle Carlos called with news about my parents' desperate attempt to salvage Rebecca's reputation. They'd contacted Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer, to ask whether there was any way to challenge my grandmother's will based on claims that I'd manipulated her during her final years. Mr. Henderson apparently told them that Elena was sharper than any of them realized, Uncle Carlos reported. She'd left detailed notes about her decision-making process and had specifically mentioned that she wanted to reward the grandchild who'd loved her without expecting anything in return. The will is ironclad, and any challenge would just result in expensive legal fees with no chance of success. By the end of that first day, the Martinez family house of cards had completely collapsed. David had returned the engagement ring and moved out of the apartment he'd shared with Rebecca. Several extended family members had called my parents to express disapproval of how they'd treated me over the years. Even some of their restaurant employees had apparently made comments about finally understanding why I'd always seemed so unhappy despite coming from what appeared to be a successful family. As I sat in Maria's living room that evening, reading messages of support from cousins, family friends, and even some of Rebecca's former classmates who'd witnessed her manipulation tactics over the years, I realized that my letter hadn't just freed me from a toxic family dynamic. It had also freed other people to acknowledge truths they'd been afraid to speak aloud for years. The woman who'd spent 26 years believing she was the problem in her family had discovered that she'd actually been the scapegoat for everyone else's dysfunction. And for the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who saw my worth without me having to prove it through perfect behavior or endless sacrifice. 6 months later, I was standing in my new art therapy studio in Portland, Oregon, watching a 15-year-old girl named Ashley create her first painting in 3 years. She'd been referred to my program after being placed in foster care when her biological family's favoritism toward her siblings had escalated to outright abuse and neglect. Like me, Ashley had spent years believing she was the problem in her family rather than the victim of their dysfunction. The clinic where I worked specialized in helping children and teenagers who'd been damaged by toxic family dynamics, and every day I used my own experience to help them understand that they weren't responsible for other people's inability to love them properly. My grandmother's inheritance had funded not just my relocation and education, but also a scholarship program for kids who couldn't afford therapy but desperately needed help processing their family trauma. My apartment was small but filled with light, artwork, and plants, all the things that made me feel peaceful and grounded. For the first time in my life, my living space reflected my actual personality rather than whatever version of myself I thought might earn approval from people who were incapable of giving it. The mail that day brought an envelope from Uncle Carlos containing updates about the ongoing Martinez family drama. My parents had apparently been forced to downsize their restaurant operations after losing several key employees who'd grown tired of the toxic atmosphere that permeated every aspect of their business relationships. Rebecca had moved back in with them after David's departure, but according to Uncle Carlos's sources, the living situation was tense and filled with mutual resentment. Most surprisingly, there'd been multiple attempts by my parents to contact me through intermediaries, but all of their messages focused on wanting me to come home and work things out rather than acknowledging any responsibility for the years of emotional abuse and favoritism. Even faced with the complete collapse of their family structure, they seemed incapable of understanding that their behavior had consequences that couldn't be undone through guilt trips or manipulation. David had reached out 3 months earlier to thank me for saving him from what would have been a disastrous marriage. He'd moved to Seattle and was rebuilding his life with people who appreciated his genuine kindness rather than seeing him as a resource to be exploited. We'd exchanged a few friendly emails, but both of us understood that maintaining contact would be complicated given our shared history with Rebecca's manipulation. The most healing development had been my relationship with Uncle Carlos and the extended family members who'd finally felt safe to acknowledge what they'd witnessed over the years. My cousin Sandra had become a regular phone friend, and several relatives had made the effort to visit me in Portland and see the life I was building away from the toxic dynamics that had shaped my childhood. Mrs. Chen, my former art professor, had helped me get my artwork displayed in a prestigious gallery in San Francisco, and 2 of my pieces had sold to collectors who appreciated the emotional depth that came from translating personal pain into something beautiful and meaningful. The recognition felt good, but more importantly, it represented my ability to create value in the world based on my own talents rather than my family's approval. One afternoon in late autumn, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a letter from Rebecca, handwritten on expensive stationery that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. The letter was an odd mixture of apology and self-justification, acknowledging some of her lies while simultaneously claiming that she'd been driven to deception by the pressure of being the family's success story. Rebecca wrote that she'd been in therapy and was working on herself, but the letter also contained requests for me to consider forgiveness and hints that she hoped we might rebuild our relationship in the future. Reading between the lines, it seemed like she was struggling without the support system that had enabled her behavior for so many years and was hoping I might be willing to resume my old role as her emotional support person. I read the letter twice, then placed it in a file with other documentation from my family drama. Rebecca's attempt at reconciliation felt like another manipulation tactic rather than genuine growth, especially since she'd made no effort to contact David to apologize for the lies that had devastated their relationship. Until she demonstrated real change through her actions rather than her words, I had no interest in reopening that door. The real test of my new boundaries came when my parents showed up unannounced at my art therapy clinic 7 months after I'd left. They'd apparently driven across multiple states without warning, believing that surprising me would somehow bypass my decision to maintain no contact with them. Seeing them standing in the reception area of my workplace, looking older and more desperate than I remembered, triggered a complex mix of emotions. Part of me felt the old familiar guilt and the instinct to prioritize their feelings over my own well-being. But a larger part of me recognized their presence as another attempt to control the narrative and force a reconciliation on their terms rather than acknowledging the harm they'd caused. "Sophia, we need to talk," Dad began, using the same authoritative tone he'd always employed when he wanted to shut down discussion and impose his will. "This has gone on long enough. We're family, and families work things out." I looked at them standing there in my professional space, trying to use guilt and obligation to override my boundaries, and felt nothing but sadness for the people they'd chosen to remain rather than the parents they could have been. "You're right that this has gone on long enough," I replied calmly. "It went on for 26 years, and I finally found the strength to stop it." They spent 20 minutes trying different approaches. Guilt, bargaining, minimizing their behavior, and ultimately threatening to cut me off financially as if I were still dependent on their support. When none of their tactics worked, they left looking confused and angry, unable to understand why their traditional methods of control were no longer effective. That evening, I sat in my apartment writing thank you notes to the scholarship recipients who'd sent me artwork and updates about their progress in therapy. These kids, who'd come from situations even worse than mine, were learning to trust their own perceptions, set healthy boundaries, and build lives based on their authentic selves rather than whoever they thought they needed to be to earn love. My letter to my family had done more than free me from their toxic dynamics. It had become a template for other people who needed permission to prioritize their own well-being over family dysfunction. Several clients had asked me to help them write their own letters to family members who'd been manipulating or abusing them, and each time, I watched them discover the same sense of liberation that comes from finally telling the truth about harmful relationships. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the scared 26-year-old woman who'd packed her belongings in the middle of the night, leaving behind everything familiar in exchange for the possibility of something better. That woman had been terrified of being alone, convinced that even toxic love was better than no love at all. Now I understood that I'd never actually been alone, I'd just been surrounded by people who were incapable of seeing my worth. The chosen family I'd built through genuine connections, mutual respect, and shared values was infinitely more nourishing than the biological family that had treated me like an inconvenience for most of my life. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who've proven they can't love you properly. Sometimes setting boundaries means accepting that certain relationships will end rather than continue to damage your sense of self-worth. And sometimes the letter you leave behind becomes the beginning of the story you were always meant to write about your own life. What would you do if you discovered that your family's favorite child had been lying about everything for years? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own self-respect? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction and finding your own path to happiness. Don't forget to share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to choose yourself over people who don't choose you back. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you deserve to be loved without conditions, supported without having to earn it, and valued for who you are rather than who someone else wants you to be. I wish you all the courage to write your own story of freedom and self-respect.